Hello and good evening and welcome to this video tutorial which is going to be on MPLS, and specifically this is going to be sort of a one-off video where we're going to be taking a look at an interesting use case that popped up at my place of employment this week, where I had a coworker come over and he was playing around with MPLS layer 3 VPNs, and he indicated that he was certain that everything was set up correctly, but that when he did his Traceroute across the provider network from the customer edge router, that he did not see. And let me go ahead and highlight this. So he was doing a trace from here, and this, I believe, is the path we're going to be taking. And he was trying to trace over to the loopback address of router 8. So we have ABC Corporation here, and it just so happened that I'm actually working on a side project here. So I actually had this configured, and it worked out that this is actually an ISR G2 router running 15.5 code. And so he had a 2901 running 15.5 code. And interestingly enough, when he tried to trace route from router 11 over to router 8, he would see the results of the trace. And when he initially came over to me, he said, hey, check this out. I'm not seeing the MPLS labels when I do the trace route from router 11 over to router 8. And so my immediate reaction, and if you're familiar with MPLS, your immediate reaction may be the same, was I said, check the PE router, or this PE router over here as well. I said, check the PE routers and the P routers to make sure that you don't have no MPLS IP propagate TTL turned on. And I immediately thought that was going to be the problem. And he said, yeah, no, I don't have it on. So I said, all right, well, let's take a look. So we took a look at it. It certainly wasn't there. And so then I was like, okay, well, let's do this. Let me go ahead and lab this up, because I've already got it set up. I just happen to have this ISR G2 that we can run this test on. And so interestingly enough, and I'm not going to clear, let's see, let me back out a few things here. I want to leave, or actually we'll go ahead and we can clear those labels out as well. So let's clear this off. So again, what we were trying to do is trace, and that's the path we're going to take. And let's see what that looks like on the command line here on router 11. So we jump onto the command line. I come over to router 11, which is just simply that Sabrent there. And so you can see it's customer A, San Francisco. So we'll go get into privilege exec, and I'm simply going to say trace over to the 8.8.8.8. And I'm going to source it from my loopback 0, because again, the loopback 0 address I'm advertising across this MPLS layer 3 VPN. So we've got reachability. And so actually, let me do this. So before we run that command, let's just say ping 8.8.8.8. And let me fix this and say I'll source this from my loopback 0 address. And you can see we've got reachability. So what happens if I come over to router 8? So if I'm on router 8, and we get into privilege exec, and I say ping 11, 11, 11, 11. And again, I always forget MPLS layer 3 VPN. Remember, when I'm pinging, the reason that that's failing is because it's choosing the source address as the outgoing interface. And the outgoing interface, which is that transit network segment between the CE and the PE routers. I'm not advertising that into BGP, or I should say into multi-protocol BGP, so that it can be communicated across or advertised across the MPLS L3 VPN cloud. So that's why I've got to source it from an address, the loopback address, which is being advertised. So again, we've got two-way connectivity. So let's go back to router 11, and this is exactly what was happening to my coworker. And let me go ahead and say trace to the 8.8.8.8, and the same rule applies here. I'm going to source it from the loopback 0 address because I know I've got reachability. And let's see what happens. Well, take a look at that. Everything works great. Now, I know, because in my setup, I know that the 10 network, this is the provider core, right? And those are P routers, right? Or label switch routers or provider routers that are doing label switching, or at least that's what you that's what you're supposed to be doing. So you see this, and immediately you think to yourself, wait a minute, something's wrong. It's not following the label switch path. And so then I said, okay, well, hold on a second. Let's do this. Let's come over here to router 8. We've already validated. We've got bidirectional connectivity. So what happens if on router 8 I say trace over to 11, 11, 11, 11, and we source it from our loopback 0 address? Isn't that interesting? Now, just a quick background. Again, not going to go deep dive into MPLS L3 VPNs, and certainly the black color is not going to work on this image. So when we take a look here, we see the bottom label and we see the topmost label, right? Now, it's just coincidental that as this is being switched through the MPLS core, that the topmost label stayed at 16, the bottommost label, right? This is assigned by BGP. The control plane is responsible for assigning that VPN MPLS label that corresponds to the VRF in which we are communicating. And then we've got, excuse me, the top of stack, right, or the top label here, and this is the one that's being switched as it goes through the provider core. And then ultimately, we get down to the last label here, which was then going to get popped off. Because we're sending IP traffic out to router 11, we're not running MPLS on the customer router. But again, as you can see here, right, does this make sense? We don't have the no MPLS IP propagate TTL command on either PE router. It's not on any of the P routers, but yet when we see the results from router 11 and then we see the results from router 8, it kind of begs the question, what's going on here? So, and again, you could, oh, sorry, I didn't want that router there. I wanted, did I just close the window by accident there? And I believe I did. Hold on one second here. Let me bring that window back up. I apologize. Whoops. There we go. All right. So again, when we ran that trace, and no, I do not wish to disconnect. Let's slide this guy back here into the position it was in. So again, on router 11, when I said trace 8.8.8.8 and I source it from my loopback 0 address, and let me pull that period back. We got a quick typo there. Right? So I know that I'm going through the core. In fact, I've got full reachability. I just don't see the MPLS labels. Now, typically, if you have no MPLS IP propagate TTL, you're not even going to see these hops, right? It's basically going to mask or hide the MPLS provider core network. And what does that look like? Well, let's jump onto router 1. And router 1 is the PE router into which router 11 is connected. Let's get into privilege exec and global config, and I'd like to make sure this is uniform here. And we would end up saying, well, actually, we don't even have to say that. So I can just simply say no MPLS IP propagate TTL, right? Hit enter, come back to router 11. Let's run this trace again. And now what does it look like? Yeah, the two 10 dots are gone. So clearly, it's following the label switch path, but we're not seeing the labels. And this is exactly what my colleague was experiencing. And so we went ahead, labbed it up, and it took about 30 seconds before it dawned on me. And I said, wait a second, is it possible that this has something to do with the licensing on the router? And so if you were to say show license, and I believe it is not detail feature, show license feature, we ran a show license feature because the ISR G2 routers are a little different than the ISR G1s. In other words, the X9XX, which is your ISR G2, as compared to the X8XX, as Cisco is constantly making changes, and there's no arguing this point because these are end of sale, end of life. These are end of support, so you shouldn't even have these in your environment. And these have just been declared end of sale, end of life, and now it's the 4X, the 4300, the 4400, and the licensing has changed again. So if you take a look here, Data K9, that is actually the license that is required in order to do MPLS. And so when I ran this command, the same output showed up, and enabled said no, that it had not been enabled. There was no K9 license on the customer edge router. So that's when I went ahead, and if you look at router 8 here, and I believe it's 15.1 if we do a show version. Yeah, so this is running 15.1.4 M12A, which is not the same if I were to simply say dir. It's this advanced enterprise K9. So now let me pull up a quick document here, which is, and this is a great, or was a great document, still can be of use if you've got a lot of ISR G2s, but it talks about the licensing, right, and how the licensing works. And so let me make my way down here through this document. And again, this is all about how to apply it and so forth and so on, but here we go. The Data K9 license is required to do MPLS. And so my thinking was, well, wait a second, could it be, is it possible that the fact that the data license, right, and you can see here the Enterprise Services iOS image on the ISR 18, 28, and 38, so those are the ISR G1s, you needed that Enterprise Services, which I had on the 28, I think it's a 2811. So we had that, but the question was, wait a second, is it possible that the reason that that customer edge router, which isn't even participating in MPLS, that it doesn't have the license installed, even a right to use license, right? And you can see here's the old iOS licenses here, and we're doing the advanced enterprise services is what we have on the router 8, right? And take a look at that. It includes, or would be suggested that for the ISR G2, you have the data license. But there's only a security license on mine, along with that IP base license. So how do we activate, and I can go ahead and close that down now, how do we activate the right to use? Because on the ISR G2s, if you don't have a license, you can activate all of the features on the router. And so if I get into global config, and this is going to be, I'm going to have to pull this back from memory. I think it is license boot module. See, and this is a 1900. Sorry, I think I was saying 2900, but it's the same difference. 1900 technology package and data K9, and that's it. Now you'll notice when I hit enter, it says use the write command to make the license boot config take effect on the next boot. So let's go ahead and type in. And what I've done is I've simply activated the right to use. So if I was to say show license by itself, we're going to see some output here. You can see the IP base K9, right? Lifetime, it's active, it's in use. Security, not in use, haven't activated it yet. Foundation Suite K9, not in use. iOS IPS, let's get down to, whoops, sorry. We'll get down to the HSEC K9. We've got no information there, but you can see that we've got IP base, security, foundation, and that is it. Nothing else is activated. So we did our write mem, and I'm going to go ahead and kick off a reload here. Hit enter, and I'll pause, and we'll come back when this comes back up, and let's find out if the culprit is the fact that this router, which isn't even participating in MPLS, is it because it doesn't have that data license that it's not even going to print for you those MPLS labels? So let's go ahead and pause, and we'll be right back. All right, so we're back. The router's finished rebooting, and now let's take a look at some of these syslog messages that we're seeing here toward the top of the screen. and you can see that it says iOS image license application license level, next reboot level IPsec K9, security K9, and data K9. So what's going to happen? Let's get into privilege exec mode here. And now let's say show license again. And let's see if anything looks different. And it certainly does, doesn't it? We've got the data K9 feature that's listed here. We've got the eval right to use, but it says not in use, right? So, and again, we're doing, excuse me, we're doing the data K9 license. So what did we forget to do? We may have forgotten to do, and let me check here. Sorry, let's get into global config. So license accept, and I think we need to accept the in-user user agreement. We may need to accept this, and I don't think that I did. And basically the end user agreement is saying that, yeah, you can activate it with the right to use, but what's going to happen is once that right to use period, I think it's like 8 weeks, 8 days or something like that, once that's up, that you're going to get yourself legit by purchasing an active legitimate license. And so you can see as soon as I accepted it, the data K9, it disappeared, right? And now it's gone again. So I think maybe I did this backwards. I apologize. We may have to go another reboot here. So let's say license boot module C1900 data K, or technology package data K9, and let's go ahead and say write mem, and then let's go ahead and do a quick reload here. So again, and we'll pause and we'll be right back as soon as this wraps up. Should have accepted the right to use end user agreement before we activated the license. All right, so the router's back up here, so let's get back into privilege exec. Let's say show license. And you can see we've got the data K9, and now it's active and in use, right? So let's give it a try. Let's find out, was it the fact that router 11 didn't have the data K9 license? And first, let's make sure we've still got connectivity. We do, if I was to say show IP route BGP, we would see that we've got that route via BGP because we're getting it from the provider edge router, and we're peering with eBGP with our provider edge router from the customer edge router. So we see the route. So here we go, the moment of truth. Is it the fact that the license was missing from the router? And take a look at that, and let's go ahead and let's make one last change here. Let's just kick off the MPLS. Let's go ahead and go back to the default, which is MPLS IP propagate TTL. And that is, again, that's the default. And you know it's the default because in typical Cisco fashion, if I said do show run, include propagate, and that was spelled wrong, we'll just leave it propa, you can see it's not there, right? When I say no MPLS propagate TTL, it shows up in the running config, but we're going to leave it as the default. So we turn it back on, which is the default behavior, and we come back to router. Is this router 11 here? No, let's get rid of this one. Not sure what that is there. ECC switch one. I'll say no for that. And I apologize. I've got these labeling of my routers is a little bit off right now. So we do the trace, and let's check. And we go to router 1, which is the provider edge router that then goes to router 4. And then we make our way over to router 8. We're missing router 3. And if I'm not mistaken, do show run include TTL. Did we have this on? Yeah, it is not on there. So back over to router 11. So you can clearly see that now it is giving me the label information. So in fact, it looks like the issue was the fact that the data license was missing. And when we applied the data license to the router today, it did the exact same thing, where it is now giving me that that MPLS information with the label information. So what about on router 8? If we were to run that command again, if I was to say trace over to 11, 11, whoops, 11, 11, 11, and source that from my loopback 0, we see the same thing. Now, I would anticipate, and again, I labbed this up pretty quickly, so it's possible that maybe something's broken in between, and that may explain why from, and let me make sure I'm on the right router here, why from router 11, we're seeing the label at router 4, but unlike router 8, right? So router 8 goes to router 3 as the PE router, then to 7, then to 4, then to 1, the other PE, and then to router 11. So we're seeing 3 label switched hops here, right? Over on router 11, how many do we see? We only see the, we only see that single label switch hop between, or I should say on router 4, right? And if I go back to the diagram, we'll take a look at our diagram here. So we're not seeing the first hop here at router 1. We are seeing it at router 4. Let me do one last thing here to see, because I would like to see all of those hops. And there we go. Okay. So, and that is what you should consistently see. And it looks, and let's make sure here. So this is interesting that it's showing it and then it's not showing it. And it could be because 4 is not directly connected with 8. So definitely some interesting behavior in this. And there we go. Now it looks to be consistent. Yeah, okay. So it looks to be consistent now. And we initially also thought that after we had eliminated the no MPLS IP propagate TTL, that it could have been, maybe it's a bug with the Cisco iOS. And you can see, take a look at that right there. It's not cooperating again, but then there it is. So again, ISR G2 routers, it appears that if you are the customer edge router and you're an ISR G2 router, that with the 15.5 code, do show version, that we're running on this show version, that we're running on this 1941 router here, we're running 15.5 3M5, that even though you're not participating in MPLS, right? There's no MPLS running on the customer edge router, and in fact, let's make sure that is the case. We were messing around. Show run interface gig 01. Yeah, MPLS IP, the command is not on the interface, right? So we are not running MPLS. It just is not set up. But in order to get the traceroute results that we're looking for, we had to apply the data K9 license so that we would be able to see this MPLS label information, which is curious because, again, we're not even participating on the CE router, that customer edge router, not participating in the exchange of labels or anything. But yet we need to have that data K9 license in order to see that the trace information. And so one last thing here, if we were to say, and let's say no MPLS propagate, now that we know that it works, this is what it would look like if we were to turn it off on the provider edge router. And so we see that initial label, but take a look. I mean, it blanked out a bunch of stuff there. And then so here we go. We're now where we were not seeing router 8 at the end. Now we are seeing router 8 at the end. So definitely some interesting behavior. And look at that. It dies at router 3, but yet we still have full connectivity. So who knows? Maybe it could be a little buggy. It could be something in my config in the core. Again, threw it together pretty quickly. But in order to see any of that MPLS information in the provider core, right, not the PE router, that label, that 26, that is the VPN label. BGP is applying that label. But in the core, on those P routers, we aren't going to see any information because we're saying no MPLS IP propagate TTL. Again, To see that information, we had to put the Data K9 license on there, which I thought was an interesting sort of twist, and wanted to share that with you. So if you're running an ISR G2 and you're trying to trace from CE to CE, and your CE router doesn't have the Data K9 license on there, it's possible that you may not see any MPLS labels as you trace through the core with MPLS IP Propagate TTL on, which means that you should normally see that information. All right, well, this is going to wrap up this video tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you pulled something out of it. Who knows, maybe one day if you're working with MPLS L3 VPNs and you've got some ISR G2 routers that you're using, this may help you out. All right, thanks a bunch. Have a great evening.